So my name is Geoff Mulgan. I'm a professor at UCL in London. I'm one of the editors of the journal. And what I hope we can do here today is ask each of you to share some of the main themes of the pieces you've written. We'll then hopefully have a bit of time for some question and interaction, and we will finish promptly on the hour. But our aim is partly to provide a non-prose based sort of summary of the ideas. And if you're ready, Scott, be good to hear first of all from you about your piece on oracles.
Okay, can you hear me, Geoff?
We can hear you perfectly fine.
I don't have the share screen thing.
Would you like it?
Sure.
Let me see. Or can I make you co-host? Let's see. Sure, I can do that. Can I? Perhaps if you start talking, I will try.
Okay. And no, great. So this is we may not need the slides. So very briefly, one of the things we've tried to do in the journal is have conversations between people who are in different fields who possibly are studying some of the same questions. And so one of the conversations that we really wanted to get going was, what are the role that oracles play in collective intelligence? And so what do we mean by an oracle? So first, an ideal oracle would be some source I can go to and get perfectly accurate information with no delay and absolutely no cost, right? So an example of this might be a Kaggle competition, right? So in a Kaggle competition, I submit my computer code and I immediately get feedback at no cost for how well my program runs. And if you look at some of the early books on collective intelligence, whether it's the book entitled Collective Intelligence or Smart Crowds or Smart Mobs, a lot of the examples in which there was this kind of like amazing group performance, there actually was something very, very close to a perfect oracle. So one of the things we wanted to think about is that, like, how do systems work where the oracle maybe isn't ideal? So let's think about the process by which people were trying to come up with COVID-19 vaccines. So the information you got wasn't perfectly accurate. There was substantial delays. And as we know, there was sometimes prohibitive cost. And so when thinking about this, when I teach collective intelligence to undergraduates or I give seminars about it, I often sort of play with this idea of an oracle, particularly for people who are scientists or business people or government people, saying, you know, you really can't achieve collective intelligence unless people know how well their solutions work. So what I decided to do is ask some leading scholars in very different disciplines to write about this. And two that jumped at it right away were Dan Leventhal, who's an organizational theorist at Wharton, who's done a lot of work on kind of firms as problem solvers, and then Deborah Gordon, who's one of the world experts on ants, who I know from the Santa Fe Institute. And the idea was for Dan to write a letter sort of to Deborah, sort of saying, here's how I think about oracles in the context of organizations. And then for Deborah to respond back and to say, you know, as a biologist, to someone who studies collective intelligence in insects, how does that differ? How does it play out? So Dan begins his piece, it's really kind of nice, by talking about, you know, that it's not like Delphi. Rarely is it the case in a business firm that you go to some oracle and you get the correct answer. Instead, what you do is you rely on these, you know, typically teams of analysts who are trying to make sense of the world. Now, one of the distinctions that Dan makes right away, which is, I think, both powerful and important, is that in business context, there's two things that we're typically predicting. One is the state of the world. So we're trying to understand exactly where we are, what's going on. The other thing that you're often trying to do is predict the payoff of a particular action. So you kind of need to know where you are, and then you need to know what happens if I'm doing this. And he also makes a distinction between, sometimes in firms, what you're really trying to do is learn from the past. So you're almost, you know, working like we think of these LLM models are doing. You're looking kind of, again, over all the past things, what has happened, or if you're doing A/B testing, right, you're learning from the past. But in other cases, what you're doing is you're predicting the future, and that the protocols within organizations are very different when you're sort of learning from the past or when you're predicting from the future. Then Dan makes this really interesting pivot. And the pivot is one that we talk about a lot in the collective intelligence community. And that is this distinction between static collective intelligence and dynamic collective intelligence, right? So you think about solving this problem, predicting this value, that's kind of classic static collective intelligence. And within organizations, one of the core types of what he sees as dynamic collective intelligence is the coordination of routines. So as a game theorist, when I teach coordination, I teach like a simple coordination game. Like, do we drive on the left side of the road or the right side of the road? But if you think of, even like the workers at a restaurant, right? You've got all these people following physical paths, right? Waiting on different people, cooking different dishes. It's this bundle of coordinated routines, right? So Arit will probably talk about this in some of her work, right? When you think about, whether it's fireflies or bees or ants, there are also these bundles of coordinated routines. One of the things then when you think about these bundles of coordinated routines is they also need oracles in the sense that each person, right, who's trying to figure out what should I do, needs to know how other people are doing, right? The other thing, and what other people think, they need feedback kind of in terms of like, how is my particular action affecting what's happening at the sort of global level? And so one of the things then that is intriguing, if you think of like sort of standard models of what we call expectancy theory in management, when we think about someone performing well within an organization, they have to have the capacity to do what they want to do, but they also have to be getting feedback from the environment, right? So there has to be sort of the signal to noise ratio has to be high enough. And one point that Dan makes sort of in conclusion is in organizations, there's sometimes global information. Like we know as a firm or as an organization or as a team how well we're doing. And then from that, it can sort of create sort of incentives to do more exploration, or if we're doing really, really well, incentives to do more exploitation. So he saw these sort of oracles not just as giving values, but even if they're crude, as being cues as to whether or not you should explore or exploit. But again, the sort of summary feeling you get from his articles that like, even though people don't talk about oracles that much in organizations, people don't use that terminology, it's at the core of what organizations do. Like you can't make decisions if you don't have effective oracles, and you can't self-organize if you don't have effective oracles. Okay, so Deborah Gordon, in her response, says, ants don't have committee meetings, right? There's no CEO, there's no organizational structure, there's no Dow Jones Industrial Average. They don't know how their colony is doing compared to other colonies. There's no like NBA playoffs for forager ant colonies. And she decided in this piece to focus on forager ants as opposed to other ants, because she thinks, and I think she's correct in this, is that most people, when they think about ants, think about these pheromone trails being left. But forager ants don't use pheromone trails. What they do is they go out and they like look for food, and then they come back and they touch their antennae, right? So they sort of like learn, they sort of smell through their antennae what the food source has been from other ants. Now, it's interesting here with pheromone trails, those are important, or generally stigmergy is important because you can follow where somebody else went. So location matters. But if you're foraging, directional information isn't very helpful. That doesn't need to be part of the oracle. So oftentimes with, bees, ants, those sort of things, we think of sort of the oracles having two dimensions, the quality of the source and the direction, the location of the source. Here, you don't really care about location because you just realize we're in an area where there's a lot of food. And so, but you just want to tell them sort of the total amount. And so what you get is this form of A/B testing coming from these ants. And what's really intriguing is they have this kind of decaying stimulus, right? So the strength of the signal depends on how long it's been, and that allows the collective to sort of learn. So the ability of the ant colony to learn in a static environment is fantastic. But when there's fluctuations in the level of the outside resource, it can become problematic. And if the outside resource is changing too fast, then the colony can't learn. And Geoff was talking about this. Geoff and I were talking about this in a meeting earlier about what's the proper pace of an organization. And one thing that Deborah sort of hints at in her article is that ant colonies kind of have evolved to learn at a rate that's appropriate given the rate at which the environments they're in fluctuate. Last sort of things that she raises, there's no specialization here, right? There's no division of labor. All these ants act independently. They all have identical skills, equal power, equal skills. And the sort of summary you get from reading both these things is that when we think about oracles, when I frame this initially, you sort of think of it as assigning a value, as giving you a perfect prediction. the thing that you get from both of these articles, which is really important, is that problem solving at its core relies on maybe two types of prediction. One is understanding the state, and one is understanding how the state determines the value. And then the last thing is, even though this wasn't part of the prompt, both immediately went to this question of sort of like, one of the big things about collective intelligence is adaptive collective intelligence, and that requires coordination of routines. And with humans, we rely on both macro and micro signals, so kind of macro oracles and micro oracles. How are we doing overall? What am I learning locally? Whereas the ants only get micro signals, and they somehow accumulate those to create macro signals. So overall, I thought this was like really sort of compelling, super useful for me as someone teaching in this area. And I guess the thing I'll end on is, if anybody like in the audience or, or and our editors think of things that they would like to see these discussions on, it'd be great, because I think these are really fruitful. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Scott. And yeah, anyone, including other speakers, do put comments or questions in the chat or thoughts on where to take this. Just one comment, maybe we'll come back to later, is on the original oracle in Delphi, has this famous saying that it neither shows nor hides, but shows a sign. So it's this almost deliberately slightly elliptical way of being oracular, which then gives to the receiver of the message the latitude to either interpret or misinterpret. And much of sort of Greek mythology is about misinterpreting the oracle's sign. Anyway, that's a slightly lateral point. Orit, over to you next, and do share if you have, if you want.
Yeah. Yes. Okay, let's see. Is it? Can you see my screen? Can you see my slides?
Yes,
okay,
we can.
Great.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. So I would like to talk. I would like to talk about a recent review that we submitted to the journal on the physics of soft, dense invertebrate aggregations, and we make a special point that we think it's time for the field to go beyond social insects, and I'll try to make that clear why in the next couple of slides. So like Scott just nicely described ants as a bundle, I think that's very much how we think about some of the structures that they create as part of their daily lives. They have some of these structures actually have of course, biological functions. Here is a movie showing army ants that create bridges that helps them traverse rough terrain as part of their foraging activity. They can also aggregate into little rafts that helps them to survive floods. And the running assumption about the mechanism of how these structures are created and what sort of collective intelligence mechanism underlies the behaviors of these groups is that there is a very interesting interplay between the micro and macro. So the micro, these individual building blocks, in this case it's ants, can sense something about either the environment or what other ants are doing, and they can interact using some physical interactions like mechanics in this particular case. And then if something happens in the environment, if there's a change to the environment, for example, there's a flood or there's some mechanical shaking that I'll show in the next couple of slides, then these individual agents, the ants, can sense that and respond. And when they respond, that changes the global behavior of the group, but it can also change their environment in some sense. So the main goal of the review was to review these kind of systems, but also to try to step outside the realm of social insects and start exploring other exciting animals. And I'm going to show the next slide, but I should probably preface that you shouldn't eat lunch while you're watching this. I don't mind. I think they're cute, but some people see it as a trigger. So, going from social insects like the ants that we've seen before, or bees, their body shape is fairly, spherical or ellipsoidal And if we step outside this regime, we can start exploring systems like fungus gnat larvae that are a little bit more elongated and a little bit going from the regime of colloids to polymers when we think about the physics of these really dense aggregations, all the way to things like worms that have very, very long, slender bodies. And as you change these characteristics, of course, you will change also the physics of the collective. So what we did in this review, we actually tried to do a comprehensive survey of all these different individual animals, worms and insects, and also some spiders. We also look at the group's properties that these individuals create, and that is shown here on the right side. And I'll focus on that for the next couple of slides just to show you a few examples. What we did is try to characterize all of these different aggregations based on their dimensionality, which is shown here on the y-axis, from 1D aggregations to 3D, and also take into account the aspect ratio of these aggregations. So just to throw out a few examples, I'll put this diagram here on the upper right, and I'll traverse a few examples on this diagram. I'll start with the example of ants that create rafts and towers in order to stabilize during floods. There is a really exciting body of work that looks at the steady state mechanics of these aggregations. Here we can see work from David Hugh, who really does classical rheology on some of these aggregations. And we also cover, of course, some theoretical aspects of these active materials. We also cover things like morphodynamics. So what happens when the environment changes? And that's work that I was partially involved with. We basically create these big aggregations or bundles of bees, and we apply some mechanical forces of them and see how they respond. We show that to stabilize the entire swarm, these bees basically follow small, faint information that is coming from the stretching of the bonds that they make to their neighbors, and that's how they're able to adapt to the environment. And we also cover some of the work on the more slender and elongated aggregations, like these California blackworms. This is work that I'm showing here in the movie. That's work done in the lab of Saad Bamla from Georgia Tech, and you can show how these blobs can not just assembly, respond to the environment, they can actually collectively locomote towards preferable areas. And again, we link it to the physics of that behavior, showing some theoretical work. So all of this is sort of examples of relatively well-studied systems, but we also made the effort to contact entomologists and researchers from other fields and try to assemble information about less well-known systems like this gnat larvae. And here is an example of how they perform locomotion, very similar to how the worms do it. We also cover one-dimensional systems that I think can be very exciting for folks who are thinking about theory. As physicists, we always like to reduce things to the lowest dimensionality, and this is a procession of caterpillars that are really creating a one-dimensional system that is traversing the environment, and we include some more recent experiments. Here you can see a couple of, here it's really just a mix of two species of caterpillars and the procession that they create. And we also, just to end, also include some less well studied behaviors like defense mechanisms. These are two different species of saw larvae, and you can see that they create these flickers as a group, and that is presumably making them less susceptible to predation when they locomote together as a group. So this was just a little taste of the kind of examples and survey that we gathered in this review. We hope that it might excite other researchers to try to come up with a more universal theory for the behavior of these kind of aggregations going beyond social insects. And I would like to just acknowledge Olga Shishkov, Dr. Olga Shishkov. She is the first author of this paper, and she really did all the hard work of gathering all this information, contacting all the researchers. So yeah, and I think with that I'll end, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Arit, and lovely videos and the challenges out there, the universal physics of how this all works, since we are all ultimately bodily. So, Professor Wang, I hope you are ready to now share. So rather different, but as you'll hear, each of these presentations has some overlapping elements. So, Professor Wang, over to you.
Right. So
we can see if you could speak up a little bit.
okay, see my screen now?
Yeah, that's good.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so today I'm glad to present one of our work that's related to collective intelligence, but from one of the sensing perspective is about the social physical sensing, which is kind of emerging new paradigm of hybrid sensing that explore the collective intelligence from both human and machines. All right, so let's get started with the physical side first. We all know we are surrounded by a lot of physical sensors, and people give more fancy names nowadays like IoT devices. And we deploy the sensors to the places of interest, many classical application, including the environment monitoring, industrial monitoring, or surveillance detection and disaster response, and so on. So for this physical sensing, normally we deploy some hardware sensors, and they sometimes are connected, sometimes are not, and they keep on collecting the information about our physical environment, and we have different scheme to retrieve reliable information from these sensors. And after deployment, they are normally highly available because they are normally dedicated sensors. But on the other side, the physical sensors have their own limitations. We observe one limitation is these sensors are normally application specific, in the sense that, for example, a temperature sensor are normally just used to measure temperature. You can hardly use a temperature sensor for example, to detect a flood, right? So, so that means for different application, you need dedicated sensors. And also some sensors need human collaboration, like UAVs or other sensors, you need a human to manipulate the sensor or control the sensors. And also some sensors have limited mobility. If there are infrastructure sensors, once they're deployed, it's hard to relocate them. As always, once you deploy a sensor network, you have to dedicate some deployment costs, and you have to maintain them. So this is on the physical side. Due to the limitations of the physical sensing, there is emerging a new paradigm called social sensing, where people or devices on their behalf are used as sensors to collect the observations about our physical world. Two prime paradigm of the social sensing include crowd sensing and also social media sensing. Some example of the social sensing, including during disasters, people are reporting what they observe about disaster on social media, and also people report, for example, gas stations availability, use some gas buddy app or traffic monitoring application, use Waze. In these social sensing applications, they have a few unique advantages. First of all, they have more coverage because people are moving around the world more naturally, and they normally have low cost because normally you don't have to deploy the sensor and maintain them. And most importantly, these human sensors, they are multi-purpose or more versatile. They can observe different things. You don't have to build dedicated sensor for a specific application like physical sensor, where humans can observe different things, and using our digital devices, we can report them as a physical sensors. But again, the social sensing is not perfect as well. It has own limitations. One big limitation is about reliability of the human sensors. This is why nowadays we get so much misinformation, like the earlier Scott mentioned, this COVID misinformation. That's I feel it's one of the root is because of the unreliability of the data sources. And another challenge we have is our social sensors we're all connected through our social network, right? So we're not as independent as its physical sensors. So sometimes you get a report, it's not very clear where is the original provenance of the data. So we call it uncertain data provenance. And also, we're not 24/7 as of physical sensors. Sometimes we drop a task, sometimes we're not available. And also there's always a privacy concern related with the social sensing paradigm. When you collect data from people, their devices, you have to consider the privacy aspect. So given the pros and cons of both social sensing and the physical sensing, a vision we propose here is, can we integrate these two sensing paradigm into one integrated paradigm we call social physical sensing, SPS for short. The idea is we want to build a unified sensing paradigm that have both components that have the strengths on both sides. Yeah, just to put things into context, here is one specific example. We developed a system called the social drone system as primarily used for the disaster response. For example, today we have a big smoky day, I think in the Midwest due to the wildfire in Canada. And for wildfire, normally, traditionally people just deploy sensors in the forest, or when the event happens, people send UAVs or helicopters there. But a lot of times we find that people also report the wildfire or other disasters on social media when it happens, a lot of time just right after the event happens. So we get a pretty good real-time sensing signal from the social sensing paradigm, and we can actually leverage that real-time signal to trigger some physical sensing system, like this case is a collaborative drone system, and we can dispatch the drones to the locations this social sensing paradigm identify and collect more firsthand or more fine-grained images and videos about this disaster, and then those images are sent back to our decision makers to make more informed and accurate decision. And also this information can be further processed to further verify the credibility and the veracity of the data we get from social media. So this is one closed loop system. We can integrate both the social part and the physical part into one holistic social physical sensing. And as you can imagine, this paradigm can be applied to many different applications. Here I have a few other examples. But due to time limit, I will not be able to elaborate them. But if you're interested, I'll point out our paper in the end. But the key idea is we want to leverage these strengths on both social sensing side, like a real-time, good coverage and low cost, as well as strengths on physical side, like the high reliability, high accuracy, and take advantage of both. However, there are some emerging challenges in this integrated sensing paradigm. Here, I just list a few major challenges we identify. I'd like to share our thoughts on them. First of all, the data collection. Now, we're not only collecting data from a single sensing paradigm, we're collecting from both sides. One clear challenge is how you can correlate these data from very different sensing paradigm. For example, when something happens in the physical world, like a disaster or even a traffic congestion, you get data stream from both social channel and the physical channel, but how you can actually correlate this data stream from two different channels to identify the same event. We can definitely use some spatial and temporal correlation between the data, but given the noises and given the privacy concerns on the social side, this is not a trivial task. And also due to integration, now we have a system that have the human component, have the cyber component, and the physical component. So it's a much more involved and complex interaction between these three components. And then our design is not just between the human and the computer, or that's just a cyber and the physical. So we have a holistic system. We have to consider all three aspects. Then how can we design the interaction between these three aspects in a holistic way? Is not a trivial task. And due to the diversity of the sensing sources, we have a natural heterogeneity in terms of both devices as well as the data. For example, we have this dedicated physical sensor to collect this streaming data in a more structured way. And we'll also have this more ubiquitous human sensor to collect the data in an unstructured way. And how can you fuse the data from both the structured and unstructured side and really integrate them into a holistic presentation of the physical world is not a trivial challenge. As I mentioned earlier, in the social sensing part, we have all the data sources. They are correlated, they are data related, and their data, again, are related with the physical side. And how can you handle this fine-grained dependency between the data sources as well as a correlation of their measurements? It's another open challenge. The next one is privacy. when you collect data from humans, you're always concerned about their privacy. And also sometimes if you correlate the physical sensing data with the social side, the privacy becomes a more significant issue. For example, if you get the GPS location from someone's mobile phones or the Wi-Fi in a shopping mall, and you correlate that with this guy's social media posts, then you can definitely unveil more information about this particular individual if you put both picture together under the same framework. So how can we further mitigate this privacy concern when we integrate the social and physical sensing is an open question. Finally, the dynamics. I think earlier we also heard about this dynamics challenge in collective intelligence. Here we have the dynamics from both physical sensing side and social sensing side, and they are correlated, especially when the event is involving the physical world. Something, if the change will definitely cause a change in the physical sensing, and that change will come back to have some changes on the social channel as well. So how can we study this correlate dynamics is also an open challenge. So here I just put a few future directions I feel that's important for us to study in this particular field. One example is about the uncertainty quantification. In the physical sensing aspect, we have relatively a good track of record to study how to quantify the signal from the physical sensor, because they have relatively good model to understand the failure of the sensors and reliability of the sensors. But for humans, it's a lot more complex than physical sensors. When you get data from human sensors, how can you quantify their uncertainty? And how can you, for example, give some confidence prediction of the result from the both social and sensing side, physical sensing side? The second example of the challenge or the direction is about the fairness. Now you are collecting data from the social aspect from people, and people are from different demographic groups. So sometimes it's likely you get more data from a particular group compared to others. Then your prediction might be biased towards a certain group if you don't do anything to mitigate that bias. So one thing we observed during the COVID is if you just look at the data from online social media, it's likely the primary sources for our data are from the younger generation compared to the older one. Then a lot of conclusion you get from that data may be just biased against the older population. So this is the open question, how you can ensure both a fair and accurate prediction using this SPS data is a big challenge. Speaking about privacy, there's always a trade-off between the privacy protection and the performance of application. To protect people's privacy, you want to keep as much data as possible at the client side or user side. But for the performance aspect, you want to get more data or information to some aggregation source. You can build more holistic model. You can do accurate prediction. So how can you explore the trade-off to have good optimal result on both sides is hard. And finally, AI is using everywhere. I think AI definitely has a role here in SPS, starting from data collection all the way to the data processing analytics. There are a lot of challenges. Probably AI have a perspective there as well. So here is one vision paper we have about this particular SPS. Yeah, just for your information. And finally, I want to just highlight this.
Very quickly, if you could, yeah.
Yeah, sure. There's the last slides about these collaboration opportunities. There are many interesting problems that can overlap with different directions. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And just so two quick comments. One is we had a big gathering of Ukrainian government last week here in London, and their use of the DIA platform is exactly an SPS, which they repurposed for spotting tanks and mobilizing both data and then collective intelligence tools to make judgments about those identifications, and then to send, well, basically, rockets to take them out. So yeah, SBS has multiple applications. And maybe a question which I'll ask all of you perhaps at the end, we've got a bit of time, is on misinformation and capacities within systems to spot misleading information. But we'll hold that for now. Professor Yasseri, can we turn to you now, and you can control the screen and share your thoughts? Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Everything looks good. Yeah, okay, brilliant.
Okay.
Thank you very much. I'm Taha Yasseri from School of Sociology, University College Dublin, where I lead the lab on sociology of humans and machines. Today, I'm going to talk about a paper published in ACM Collective Intelligence recently, which has the title, "The Cost of Coordination Can Exceed the Benefits of Collaboration in Performing Complex Tasks." Rather long title, I just noticed. But the idea is very simple. We all appreciate working in teams. If you Google for images with the search term teams or groups, you find lots of images of happy people very excitedly working with one another. We have terms such as collective intelligence or wisdom of the crowd, which both suggest that there is benefits in being part of a bigger team. The advantages could appear in enhancement in accuracy of the task, accuracy of the teams in performing the tasks, and efficiency. Not only they do the tasks better, but also they do them faster. However, there has been evidence also suggesting that there are disadvantages to teamwork. For example, there could be biases or herding effects, or there could be social loafing, where when you're a team, you rely on other team members to do the job for you, and your effort decreases, and even the collective effort of the team could be less than the sum of the individual's effort when they were working alone. So even in the pop culture, when you look at expressions such as two heads are better than one, which suggests that dyads or teams of two would be performing better than individuals, but then at the same time we have expressions such as too many cooks spoil the broth, which suggests the opposite. I found a picture of a few cooks here who look very unhappy. It suggests that the broth perhaps has been spoiled in this case. So there is this conflict in the literature, in the pop culture, and in day-to-day basis, we always have to make the decision that should I do this alone on my own, or should I ask someone to help me? To test this and to try to contribute to resolution of this conflict, we turned into an experimental design where we used an existing real-world citizen science project called Wildcamp Gorongosa, which is named after Gorongosa National Park in Mozambique. The citizen science project, which is quite entertaining, I must say, is as the following. There are photos taken automatically from this national park, and the citizen scientist's job is to look at these pictures and try to identify, well, first of all, if there is an animal there, and then what type of animal, what species of animal they are, how many of them, and then more specific questions such as, is it a young animal, is it a baby goat, or is it the older one? What are they doing? Are they sleeping? Are they eating? Are they walking? And a few other questions. This is an ideal experiment because it is quite difficult. I have tried it, but also it's something that you learn rather quickly. Within half an hour, let's say, your performance increases as you try to, describe more and more images. So what we did in the experiments, basically, we had a subset of all the images on specific species that are rather similar and therefore difficult to distinguish. And we asked the participants to identify these images for us and answer all the other questions that the platform wants them to answer. But before that, we had a training session. And during the training, to half of the participants, we gave a similar sample of images, so they were prepared for the test. To other half, we gave a more general sample of images, which had more diverse set of animals. So therefore, they were not really prepared for the test. So the first group, we call them targetedly trained or targeted set participants, and the second group are more generalists. You can think of them as experts and generalist people or non-experts as well. First of all, let's have a look to see if this works in practice, whether the training could affect the performance in the test. And the answer is yes. The upper curve shows the efficiency of participants, how many correct answers per minute they have submitted over the course of the experiment. We see that, well, they improve their efficiency as they start the experiment, But then when we start the training part, the testing part, out of the sudden the efficiency declines because the task becomes more difficult for them, those participants who were trained on a general set. But then when you look at the expertly, or those participants who were trained on the targeted set, you see that not only their performance doesn't decline, but they keep becoming better and better. And it's almost independent from the type of the task, be it identification of the species or counting the animals, or less complex tasks, such as just saying if there is an animal in the picture or not. So this setup seems to be working. The next thing, of course, is to create groups, because the first question that I started with was whether groups are better than individuals. So we can create 3 types of groups, putting 2 experts together, putting 2 generalists together, or create a mixed group of 1 expert and 1 generalist participant. First of all, let's have a look at when we compare a general diet, 2 non-experts working together, to a single generalist. We see that, in fact, the efficiency, the number of correct answers per time, declines even further when you have 2 generalists working together. The red curve is way below the gray curve. But if you have a mixed diet, that means that 1 expert and 1 non-expert, the performance is slightly better, but interestingly, both teams of 2 underperform compared to a single generalist working on their own. So there is absolutely no benefit in working together. When you compare and look at the team of 2 experts and a mixed group of expert, non-expert, again, both teams underperform compared to a single expert working on their own. So both of these cases suggest that there is very little benefit in being part of a team of 2 rather than getting the job done alone. When you look at the accuracy, in the case that we are not interested in time, we are just interested in the number of correct classifications. However, we see that having an expert in the team improves the accuracy compared to the case of 1 generalist working alone or having 2 generalists working together. So the mixed group of expert, non-expert actually maintains the accuracy when you enter the testing phase of the experiment. However, when you compare a single expert, an expert person working alone, to a group of them or a mixed group, you still see that that single expert even has higher accuracy than the other 2 groups. So the last thing we want to look at is time, because we see that the accuracy could be improved by having an expert, but efficiency cannot. And when you look at the pace, which is just simply how many images they analyze or they classify per time, regardless of the correctness of their classifications, we see that they are very similar to the images at the top, only the differences are exaggerated. Which simply suggests that the main challenge here, the reason for the biggest declines, is the cost of coordination, which shows itself as slowing down the process. Basically, teams take more time to make a decision, and that is because they have to talk to one another, and they lose some time, which turns out to be more important, or the loss is bigger than the benefit of having that expert in the group. All the stories that I told you depends on the accuracy of the task, on the complexity of the task. As I mentioned, we have different tasks with different levels of complexity. I showed you one example, and I hope this gives you enough motivation to look at the paper to see other examples when the story might be slightly different. I must say that when we have simpler tasks with less complexity, there is less surprise in the findings of our experiment. Ironically, this work was not done alone. I did this project with 2 of my colleagues, Vincent Straub and Melina Teleskova. And well, thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you very much. And I should say we were quite keen to publish this paper because it is, in a way, a confounding paper, and it's crucial to the science of collective intelligence to look at examples where greater numbers or teams or whatever don't necessarily lead to better problem solving, identification, and so on. It's through those sort of counterexamples that we can progress the rigor of the science. So hence the interest in in this paper, and we'll look for other, as it were, confounding papers in the future too. So our final speaker is Claudia Winkelmeyer. I hope I pronounced your name right. And and you got some slides to show as well, Claudia.
Thank you very much. Let me just start the presentation. So can you see the full screen version?
Not yet. If you can press screen or slideshow or something.
Something like this?
That's it. Perfect. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. So thank you very much for the invitation again. I'm going to talk today about our paper called Collective Decision Strategies in the Presence of Spatio-Temporal Correlation that came out at the beginning of this year and was work done together with Albert Cow and Joe Coleman and Pablo Romanchuk. So this is a modeling study. I'm going to give you a short motivation of like where we started from, then just describe the model and show you a couple of our results. So I think this ties very nicely to the previous talk. It's known in many circumstances that deciding as a group can be beneficial to collective accuracy. And in fact, often we see like a steady increase in accuracy with group size. And this is a phenomenon called the wisdom of crowds. This phenomenon has been known for a very long time. For example, many of you might be familiar with this paper by Sir Francis Galton from 1907, where he surveyed visitors of a country fair that had to guess like the weight of an ox. And even though the individual guesses were showed a wide range, the average was very close to the actual weight. And many more examples of wisdom crowds have since been observed, but there's a common critique saying that many of these examples rely on very strict assumptions regarding the decision environment. So some of these assumptions, for example, are that there's a single information source, like the ox that we see, or another important assumption is that decisions are made independently and instantaneously, and also that the decision is between two sources. So in 2014, Albert Cow and Ian Cousin have developed a modified wisdom of crowds model where they challenged first two of these assumptions. So they used two information sources, source A and source B. And source A, that we show in blue here, provides independent information to the individuals. Individuals attending to source B will receive spatially correlated information. And that means that all the individuals attending to B will receive the same sample. And Cow and Cousin could then show that this change to the decision environment will strongly affect the decision accuracy, and that we will not anymore observe the wisdom of crowds, at least not for all parameter values, but instead we find this peaking of accuracy at intermediate group sizes. And so in this paper, we aim to challenge the third of the assumptions that I listed before, so the instantaneous decision making. And we built on the model by Cow and Cousin and extended it to the temporal domain. So let me briefly describe the model. We have, again, these two information sources, but now they produce bit streams of information. And then we assume that the individuals integrate this information over time. Once every individual is decided, we aggregate the votes to a majority vote. To a majority vote. I can illustrate this a bit further. Again, we have a distinction between source A and source B, and source A is independent. And in this temporal context, yes. Sorry. Did you want to say anything, or should I continue?
Please continue.
Okay. So source A is independent, and in this context, this means that all the individuals receive samples that are independent in space, in time, and across individuals. And so on the left here, you see a couple of examples of these bit streams, and then on the bottom, you see the integration pattern. Source B, on the other hand, is correlated, and now in this temporal version of the model, we have two types of correlation. We have spatial correlation, as in the instantaneous model. And in this setting, this means that the individuals will receive identical bit streams, and then they will also perform the integration in unison. And the second type of correlation that we're dealing with is temporal correlation. And in this case, the bit streams themselves will be different, but the same bit of information can be shown for longer time periods. So the final aspect of the model that I want to highlight is that now that we're in this temporal domain, we can also think about switching between information sources. And so we introduced a switching parameter that scales between a scenario where the individuals attend to the same cue throughout the trial and the other extreme where the individuals switch at basically every time step. So it's a bit complicated model, but the question that we're then asking is, how does this temporal integration and cue switching affect collective accuracy in the wisdom of crowds? And for the final minute, I want to show you two of our main results. This figure shows a scenario where QB is spatially, but not temporally correlated. And if we think about it, if no switching takes place, this is very similar to the model by Kao and Cousin. And so in fact, in the dark green line here, you see the characteristic peak at lower accuracy. So this is collective accuracy versus group size, and we see this peak. However, when we allow individuals to switch between cues, then the spatial correlation is broken. And we can, again, see a monotonous increase of accuracy with group size. So we can recover the wisdom of crowds by switching. And so now the second example that I want to show is a scenario where QB is correlated in time, but not in space. And again, we have accuracy versus group size. And now the third parameter, the different shades of purple, show the length of the correlation of QB. So light purple means that B is not correlated at all. And then increasing darker shades show stronger correlation until in the darkest shade of purple, B just produces a single bit of information that is constant throughout the trial. And so in a scenario where individuals are not allowed to switch between cues, we find that accuracy increases with group size and the effect becomes stronger and stronger, the stronger the correlation of B. But if we allow the individuals to switch, this effect is reversed. And now we see that accuracy actually decreases with group size. And so the very short explanation for this phenomenon is that temporal correlation will impact the individual decision integration process. So individuals make their decisions faster. And so if we have no switching, the group attending to correlated cue will be isolated and can be outweighed by the individuals attending to independent information. But if we allow switching, this strong temporally correlated information can be disseminated across the entire group and thus affect the collective decision. So to sum up, what we did is we extended a model for collective decision making to the temporal domain, and we find a rich set of decision dynamics. And the two results I presented are that switching between information sources can restore the wisdom of crowds in cases of spatial correlation, whereas if information is correlated in time, the switching between sources can be detrimental to collective accuracy. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Claudia. Very, very interesting and complex analysis. We've got only a very few minutes before we finish. So there's two questions, and you maybe choose which one very briefly to comment on. One might be any steers you would give to a real-life organization or community based on, the research you've just showed, or the question of misinformation and error. How in your model to cope with the problem of error spreading through a group, or whether it's of insects or humans. So you choose which one, just very briefly to comment on. Maybe Ori, to start with you.
It's really interesting to think about misinformation in the context of a honeybee colony, for example, which is presumably very altruistic, and we haven't seen that, at least in the experiments that my lab is involved with. But I can imagine when you go outside the colony, perhaps there's some behaviors like robbing other colonies of their honey and things like this, where some of these more misleading information can take place. I'm not sure I have something very intelligent to say about this, just that it's a very interesting problem.
And it's more often between species as well, deliberate confusion. Dong Wang, any thoughts from you?
Yeah, I probably also comment on the misinformation because some of my work is related on this aspect. I think one thing we observe is if you just look at the content of misinformation, that's probably one deciding factor how widely it was spread across the crowd. But a lot of misinformation tool currently focus on detecting or flagging these misinformation based on its content. But I want to add that the explanation, in addition to this binary detection or flagging, is also important to interrupt the misinformation spread. And also this explanation should not just come from the content itself, but also from probably the social context. Yeah. For example, where this misinformation is originated and how it's spread so far and how people react to this misinformation. I think this richer context probably can serve as more comprehensive understanding of the misinformation. Yeah, that's just my 2 cents.
Thank you. And Taha?
Well, I'm not sure if it's really helpful, but my suggestion to the organization, I take the first question to the organization, is that the task of the building teams is not straightforward. You have to know what are you after efficiency, are you after accuracy, time matters or not, and how complex the tasks are. In education, it's very common these days to ask people to teach together. I'm not sure, for example, that works necessarily for all sorts of courses at all different levels. So the combination of the teams or the composition of the teams and the complexity of the task could be very important in making that decision of whether let people work alone or ask them to work together.
Yeah. At one point, the data on giving kids a laptop in classes showed giving one for each 2 children was more efficient than giving one to each child, but that may no longer be true. Claudia, a final thought from you.
Yeah, I can maybe also comment a little on the misinformation part because our model is pretty abstract, so it's not clear where to apply it directly. We have discussed like one aspect, for example, in online scenarios where we believe that like misinformation or deliberate fake news could be cast in the light of temporally correlated information, in the sense that true and like real life news would be much more independent, changing over time, whereas temporal correlation would be much more consistent narrative that might be pushed from a certain actor. And I think our framework would allow us to at least quantify or describe like how effective these consistent narratives could be in driving corrective decision.
Look, thank you very much. And thank you all for giving incredibly clear, visually compelling talks, which really amplify, I think, the prose version. We will put this recording up very shortly, and hopefully you'll get some feedback from people viewing the video. Thank you all very much. We're out of time, and do keep submitting pieces to the Collective Intelligence Journal. Hopefully some of you will be coming to the conference in November in the Netherlands, the annual CI conference as well. Have a good day or evening wherever you are. Thank you.
Thank you.